Yeah, I hope all of you can hear me. Okay, great. Okay. So thanks for joining in. I'm Prabhas Sirivadana from WSO2, and all of you are doing good and staying safe. Okay, so this is our first meetup in a series of meetups we plan to do targeting IAM developers. So here we are going to talk about JWT. Okay. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All of you are muted now, and if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I think there's an option on Zoom to do that, or else you can use the Zoom chat. Okay. So let's get started. Yeah. So this is about me. So I've been with WSO2 for almost 13 years and leading the WSO2 identity server. It's an open source identity and access management product. And I've written a few books as well. Okay, so let me turn off the video. Okay. Yes, so yeah, so in this session today, we are going to cover the basics of JWT. So we don't expect you to know anything about JWT, but probably if you have some understanding about OAuth, OpenID Connect, and some security principles, so that will be helpful. And so we'll start with the basics, then go to the internals, do some hands-on stuff, and then we'll see what are the applications of JWT. So there we'll talk about Kubernetes, Istio, OPA, and other stuff. So if you haven't heard of those stuff or haven't used them, so that's fine. You don't need to need those tools to understand JWT, but if you know them, and then you'll understand it better how you can use JWT. So before doing a formal definition on JWT, let's have a look at JWT. So this is the most common form of JSON web token. So unless your brain is trained to do base 64 URL encoding, so this looks pretty garbage, right? So this doesn't make any sense. But if you dig deep into this string, what you see on the screen now, so it has three parts. So the first part is this one. So there's a dot, and there's a second dot which separates the second part and the third, right? So the first part is known as the HUSE header, right? So HUSE is the working group under IETF, which works on JSON web signature and JSON web encryption algorithms. JWT is a spec or RFC came out of the OAuth working group of under IETF. So there are three parts. The first is a HUSE header, or you can call it JWT header. Then you have the payload. You can also call this as claim set. And then finally, the third part is signature, right? So each of these parts, the first two parts, so this is base 64 URL encoded, and this part is also base 64 URL encoded. And this is a signature of the first two parts, the JWT header and the JWT claim set. So remember, so this is not base 64 encoded, but base 64 URL encoded. So there's a difference between those two. And yeah, so if you move to the next slide, so here you can see the decoded version of the JWT. So when you decode the first one, simply base 64 URL decode it, then you will find this one. This is the HUSE header or JWT header, and this is the JWT payload base 64 URL decoded. So you can use any online tool. Maybe you can try it out too. So if you just copy this string here, you just copy this string and go to online tool which does base 64 URL decode, copy this one, right? So it should produce this one, right? So this is basically the algorithm. Yeah. So the JWT header, the HUSE header, defines the characteristics of the signature, like how you sign the payload. So anyone having this JWT can verify the signature. So here it's using RS256. And the values for this algorithm, it's defined in another spec called JWA. So JWA, you can find all the algorithms that you can use to sign a JWT. Once again, if you take the JWT RFC, it doesn't define this ALG header. So it's defined in a different spec called JWS. And these are the attributes that you find in the JWT spec. But once again, for a given JWT, none of these are mandatory attributes. These are defined in the JWT spec, but it's not mandatory. So whatever the application of JWT, they can define the mandatory and optional attributes. So that's what you can find in OpenID Connect. So we'll talk about that later. So so some of the important attributes is subject. So subject is basically the owner of the JWT. So whatever the claims that you see in the claim set of the JWT, it's corresponding to the subject. So this is the user. So this JWT talks about this particular user. Then AUD, or the audience parameter, it talks about the recipient, right? So subject is the owner of the JWT, audience is the recipient of the JWT. Say you have this particular JWT and you pass it to someone else, some third party, some application, then this AUD should represent that. So we'll talk about audience later. So NBA for the not before value is you shouldn't be using this JWT before this type. So issuer is the one who issues the JWT. Expiration is obvious, then issued at is the issued at time. JTI is a JWT identifier. So there's a unique identifier for this particular JWT, but this is unique for the issuer. So we'll talk about this later as well. Okay. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put that on the Zoom group chat. So this is an analogy to explain how JWT works. Let's think about a use case where you have a DMV and you have a driving license from your state DMV, and then you want to buy a beer, right? So to buy a beer, you need to present your driving license. So you need to prove that you are elder than 21, right? So now to do that, you give your driving license. Now let's think this driving license is a JWT. Right? So now if the driving license is a JWT, then the issuer of the JWT is a DMV. Right? So DMV is the one which issues the JWT and the driving license. So in that driving license or the JWT, it has a set of claims. So these claims talk about you. In this particular case, Peter. So you may have the first name, last name, age, or email address, any attributes of this particular user. Okay. So there's a question here. What's the namespace for subject in a JWT? So there's no namespace for SUB in JWT. So it's SUB as it is. The reason is, so there won't be any conflict on that particular attribute ID. The reason is, if you take the JWT RFC, so JWT RFC defines these 7 attributes, right? So these 7 attributes are defined in JWT specification and they are registered in the so there's a specific claim registry, they are registered in there. So if you cannot use SUB as a custom claim, right? So SUB is a fixed one, it has a defined meaning. Okay, so now in the JWT that you get, subject attribute ID would carry the value Peter. Right, so now you can pass the JWT to the bartender, and if bartender trusts the issuer of the JWT, in this case DMV, it will verify the signature and then will let you in or issue a beer for you. So JWT can carry attributes as well as it can carry other assertions as well. So attribute, you can call them as attribute assertions. Also you can carry entitlement assertions. So entitlement assertions are decisions about what you can do at the recipient side. For example, in this case, the bartender only needs to know whether your age is greater than 21, right? So the DMV should not share the age of the user, right? Or the date of birth of the user. They can simply say the user is greater than 21, or you can simply say this particular user is eligible to buy a beer. So that we can call as an entitlement assertion, and simply you can pass it in the JWT to the bartender, and if bartender trusts the DMV, it will accept the JWT. So once again, this trust relationship between the issuer, the DMV, and the recipient or the audience of the JWT is established through signature validation. So if you look at the JWT, so JWT has a signature, and the bartender, the recipient can validate the signature if it knows the public key of DMV. So once again, we talked about audience element, right? So here the bartender is the audience of JWT. So the JWT that you get from DMV should have a value known to the bartender, right? So whenever you get the JWT at the recipient side, you first need to check whether this is a JWT issued to me, right? If it is not, you should simply reject it. Okay. So let's dig into more details. Okay, so now let's try to define a JWT. So you can define JWT in this way. It's a container to transport data between interested parties in a cryptographically safe manner, right? So this cryptographically safe manner guarantee comes from the signature. You sign in the data that you transport in the JWT. So nobody in the middle can alter. Like if somebody also alters it, then whoever receives the JWT can validate and find it. Okay, so there's another question. Is there a limit on the JWT size in general? So no, there is no limit. But as a practice, you should not bloat a JWT. You should try to like minimize whatever the information you put. But in general, like so there's no defined size for JWT. Right? And usually you don't send the JWT over the browser. So it will be like you get the JWT in a direct connection, direct request to the issuer. And also you pass it along with the direct connection. So there's no restriction in terms of number of characters that you get from this browser URLs. Okay, so let's move on. So now when to use a JWT? So you can use JWT to propagate one's identity information between interested parties, right? So let's say you want to pass some user's information to a microservice, right? So then you create a JWT. Let's say you are the issuer of JWT. You create a JWT. You put set of attributes. You sign it. Then you pass it to the microservice, right? So that's a one use case of JWT. You can use it even within the microservice deployment when one microservice talks to another microservice. And also you can use a JWT to propagate user entitlement. So that's what we discussed before. Okay, and you can use JWT to transfer data over unsecured channel. Like since it is signed, nobody can change. Like if somebody change, you can detect it at the recipient side. But if you worry about the confidentiality, then of course you can use message level encryption with JWE, which we'll discuss later. Okay? And JWT is another way of asserting one's identity, given that recipient of the JWT trusts the asserting party. So in our previous example, DMV is the issuer or the asserting party, right? Okay, so there's a question on why by public key you mean the secret key. Public key is used to verify the signed JWT. Yes, so we'll talk about how you verify the JWT later. Yes, so the public key is the key corresponding to the key used to sign a message, right? So when you use like algorithm like RSA, then you have the public key which is known to the recipient, and you sign the message with the corresponding private key. Okay, so let's try a small Java example to build the JWT. Okay, so here I'm using Nimbus Java library to create a JWT, right? So I'm using RSA SHA-256 as algorithm. So here you can see I create my claim set. I can set who is the issuer, right? So then the subject and the expiration, not before, time, then JWT ID and issue time, right? Then I set the create the JWT header with my algorithm, and then I pass my private key, the one I'm going to use to sign this particular JWT, and then create it, right? So let's run this and see. Okay, so now I get this particular string. So this is my JWT. Right. So now if you go here and let's go to JWT IO. This is a JWT. You can use this to decode your JWT, and you can find the base64 URL decoded JWT, right? So this is the header, we specify the algorithm, and this is the claim set. Okay. Yeah, that's a very straightforward example, like how you can build JWT, and there are other libraries too from different languages you can use based on your choice. Okay. Now let's talk about how to build a JWT, right? So we know that there are three parts in a JWT: the HUSE header, then the payload or the JWT claim set, and then the signature. The first step is you need to decide how you are going to sign the payload, or like what are the attributes you will consider, like signature algorithm and those stuff. Then create the header, right? So you will end up with this particular JSON object, right? So I'm going to use RS256 as my signature algorithm, right? So now I created the HUSE header as a JSON payload. The next step is I need to base64 URL encode this one, right? So here I'll base64 URL encode this header. Now I'll end up with this payload, right? Step 3, next I can construct the payload in any way I need, right? So here this must be a JSON object, right? So if it is JWT, the claim set must be a JSON payload. So you create a JSON payload, you can put any attribute here in the way you want. Then after that, you get the base64 URL encoded of this particular payload. So now you have the base64 URL encoded header, then base64 URL encoded payload. Okay, so I think, so there are two more steps missing in the slides. Anyway, I'll explain that. So next what you can do is you combine the output from this one step to this one with this one with a dot, and then you sign the entire thing, and then you get the signature. Then you will base64 URL encode that as well, and then you end up with your string, the JWT, which has three parts, right? HUSE header dot claim set dot the signature, right? So that's how you build a JWT. So once you have the JWT, you can pass it to any recipient. Then at the recipient side, the first step is you need to verify the audience. So I get a JWT. First, I need to check whether it's a JWT targeting me, right? To validate that, I need to look at the audience element. So audience element will carry a string. So this is simple string, which I should understand, the recipient should understand. So, and also the issuer should know, like if issuer is issuing a token to me, then it should add an identifier known to me as the audience, right? So I'll validate this one. So once again, if you want to use a single JWT between multiple services, right? Multiple recipients. So this would be a common use case when you have multiple microservices. You get one JWT, and the same JWT will be passed to multiple microservices. Then you can have a regex. You can define the audience value as a regex. So when you validate that, you need to honor this particular regex, right? So this particular JWT may be valid for let's say order.ecom.com service, then delivery.ecom service, inventory.ecom service, like that. Then you can define your own way of verifying the audience value. Then you need to verify the issuer. You need to see whether this JWT comes from an issuer you know about. Once again, issuer is just a string, right? And then you need to verify whether the token is expired, whether the issued at time is in the past, and not before time is so not before time is basically valid, right? It should be in the future. Then after that, you can verify the signature. Now to verify the signature, so you can find out the metadata related to signature from the header, like signature algorithm and those stuff. After that, you need to know the public key corresponding to the signature, right? So there's a question says while signing, the string includes the dot as well, isn't it? Yeah. So string includes one dot, right? So dot is like let me, if you go here to this one, so this one, so this is a full JWT. So this is the full JWT. Let me paste it here. Okay, this is a full JWT. The string will include header, dot, and the payload, right? So the first dot is included in the payload that you sign. Okay. Now, okay. So now you validate the signature. Okay. So you can have a look at the RFC 8725. It defines best practices in creating a JWT and also verifying a JWT. Okay. So now to verify the signature, first you can look at the ALG or the algorithm attribute in the Jose header, right? So once again, if you just take the JWT spec itself, you can use any value for the algorithm parameter which is coming from the JWA spec. Then again, even you can use none for the ALG, right? So if you use none, then you don't have a signature, right? So basically in your JWT, there will be only two components, JWS header, Jose header, and the claim set. There won't be any signature part, right? So you should try avoid using ALG part. If you look at the OpenID Connect spec, right? So OpenID Connect, in the OpenID Connect spec, it has an ID token, right? So ID token is a JWT, but if you look at the OpenID Connect spec, it says even though ID token is a JWT, you should never use none as the ALG parameter in the Jose header. Okay. Then also, so during the signature verification, you need to find out the public key, right? So to verify the signature. So the Jose header defines 7 ways to reference your public key, right? So the 7, you won't include all the 7 ways, all of them are optional, but you can include any of those ways, right? So there are 3 kinds of ways that you refer public key. The most straightforward one is you can just embed the private key into the Jose header itself, right? Either it can be a JSON web key or a X509 certificate. You can just include it. The other one is you can refer to an external endpoint. You can say this is the endpoint to get your JSON web key or the certificate. So in that case, the recipient of the JWT you don't need to have the public certificate with you. You can simply talk to the corresponding endpoint and fetch it and cache it locally. The third one is you can just reference it. You can just give an ID. So this is an identifier. Then you need to have the public key with you, locally stored, and use the identifier in the JWT or the Jose header to retrieve that one, right? So most common use case is that you send a URL, then from the URL, the recipient can fetch the public key and verify the signature. Okay, so there's one interesting question. Can a JWT be revoked? If so, how do you know if it is being revoked? Yeah, so revoking a JWT it's tricky, right? So you issue a JWT. To validate the JWT, you don't need to talk to the issuer, right? So since you are not talking to the issuer, you don't know whether JWT is revoked or not, right? So general practice is if you are using a JWT to access some resource, then have a very low expiration time. So even if it is exploited or someone steal the JWT, compromised, then the impact is very minimal if you have a low expiration time. Or else you can build some eventing mechanism from the issuer side whenever the token is revoked to communicate that decision to reliant parties. So you can use some like a pub sub mechanism to propagate those events. Yeah, so there's a question, is there any expiration time, is there any EXP time as a best practice? So it depends on the use case, like how much security you need. If you take normal microservices deployment, if you're really concerned about security, then you need to have low expiration time. For example, if you take Netflix deployment, so Netflix microservice deployment, so they are using short-lived certificates, and the expiration of short-lived certificates, it's around like 4 minutes. So you can go for a very low value based on how critical your infrastructure is and how much you worry about security, but there's no fixed value. It all depends on your use case. Yeah, I think we talked about all these 3 cases, how you reference. You can external reference, that's through a URL, then embedded key. So you have the key in the certificate or the JWK, JSON web key in the JWT itself, or else a key identifier where you can use that to retrieve from a local storage. Okay, so now let's revisit our definition of a JWT, right? So JWT is a compact serialized JWS or a JWE. So this is the precise definition of JWT, and some people get this confused too, right? So there's something called JSON web signature. So JSON web signature or JWS, there's an RFC for that. It defines how you can represent a signature, right, of a payload. JWE define how you can encrypt and represent a payload, encrypted payload, right? So this JWS and JWE can be serialized in 2 ways. One way is compact serialized. The other one is JSON serialization. So we'll go through JSON serialization later. But we call it a JWT only if you use compact serialized, right? So the precise definition of JWT is it's a compact serialized JWS or JWE. Or in other words, when you say JWT, that means it's compact serialized, right? Okay. So so what we discussed before, like how you build this JWT, how do you validate JWT is related to the compact serialization, because the JWT is always compact serialized, right? So this is what you already saw. JWS as a JWT, compact serialized JWS, and this is once again JWT, but here it's encrypted too, right? Compact serialized JWE, right? It's also a JWT, but most of the time we see JWTs with signature only. We don't see encryption is much used, but it's a good application of JWT as well. Okay, so this is JWS. I think we briefly talked about this one. So it's a way to represent a signed message. And a JWS, this is another misconception some people have. So you think you can only represent a JSON payload with JWS. No, that's not true. You can even sign any text and represent that as a JWS, right? But remember, if it is to be a JWT, it has to be compact serialized, and the payload must be a JSON payload, right? But for JWS, you don't have that requirement. So every JWS is not a JWT. A JWS can be serialized in 2 formats: compact serialization, JSON serialization. Only a compact serialized JWS is called a JWT. So this is a representation of a JSON serialized JWS. So we won't go to details. One main difference between JSON serialized and compact serialization is, with JSON serialization, for the same payload, you can have multiple signatures, right? But if a JWT with compact serialization, you can only have one signature, right? But here you can have multiple signatures of this particular payload, and this particular payload can be anything. It can be JSON, XML, binary, anything. Okay? This is a representation of a JWE. So a JWE represents an encrypted message using compact serialization or JSON serialization, but we call it a JWT if only it is using compact serialization. Yes, so there's another question asking, does it mean the message has signed with different algorithms? Yes. So here you can have one payload and you can have multiple signatures, and inside these headers, right, you can define the algorithm. So each signature can have its own signature algorithms and their own keys. Okay, so let me share another workaround here. So still, even though you have multiple signatures, you can you cannot like partially sign the payload, right? It's the same message you sign all the time. So the workaround for that is inside this protected header. So if you look at this protected header, each signature element inside the signature array, you have a protected element, right? So this is once again a JSON payload. This is part of the Husey header. So if you want like some custom data to be signed with different keys, then what you can do is rather than putting it inside the payload, you can add it to the protected header, right? So then you can see different text being signed by different keys. So even when you encrypt that, you can do it. Okay, so this.
What is the advantage of doing that? Like different payloads signed using different keys.
Okay, yeah. So it is more useful in case of encryption, right? So you had the same message, but only the related corresponding parties can view part of the message. Right? So if you look at this was very popular in SOAP world when you use WS security, you can partially encrypt the message in SOAP world. So this is similar to that, but still the payload is same. So even in this case, JWT, you have one payload, you can encrypt it with different keys. Yeah, so once again, yeah, feel free to unmute and ask any questions if you want. Okay, so now, so that's some like internals about JWT. So let's move into the applications. So I assume all of you know about OAuth. So one use case of JWT is use JWT as the OAuth access token, right? So an OAuth access token can be a self-contained access token or a reference access token, right? In many places we see reference access token, right? So a reference access token means, so if it's a client who invokes an API passing access token, if it's a reference token, then to validate this token, the gateway has to talk to the authorization server all the time, right? Because it doesn't carry any information that you can validate by yourself. But if it's a self-contained token, then when you pass that token, the gateway doesn't need to talk to the authorization server. The token itself contains information where the resource server, the gateway can validate, and you can use a JWT for that. So once again, like up to now, there's no standard to define the format of this particular JWT. But if you look at the OAuth working group, so there's a new RFC coming up, still at the early stage, to define how this self-contained access tokens with JWT should look like. So that's the one use case of or an application of JWT. Another very popular application of JWT is OpenID Connect, right? So OpenID Connect is the identity layer built on top of OAuth, right? So yeah, so this should be JWT, not JET. So ID token in OpenID Connect is a JWT, right? So once again, if you remember correctly, inside the JWT claim set, so there are multiple attribute IDs defined by the JWT RFC itself, but none of those attributes are made mandatory. But the OpenID Connect spec make some attributes mandatory. For example, the issuer attribute ID in JWT, it's mandatory if you are going to use a JWT as an ID token with OpenID Connect, right? So likewise, so you have the JWT and you can build multiple applications and profiles on top of that. And those profiles can define what are the attributes you need to have in a JWT and what are the mandatory attributes and what are the optional attributes likewise. Okay, so once again, yes, so JWT can be encrypted or signed, and if you use ID token, if the ID token is encrypted, it has to be signed first and then encrypt. So that's the normal belief. Like first, you usually sign the clear text payload, then on top of that, you can apply encryption, right? So let me do a quick demo on the first one, the self-contained access token. So here I'm using WSO.ID server as IDP who issues the tokens, right? So you can just download it from WSO.com. So this is all open source release under Apache 2.0 license. So I can log into the console. Okay. Then here I can create a OAuth service provider, an application. So I already have an application called Pika. Right. So this supports multiple authentication protocols like SAML, OpenID Connect, WS Federation, and those stuff. Here we only need an OAuth client to create an OAuth client. So you go here and you can pick whatever the grant types you need, and then I need to check JWT as a token issuer. So when you pick this option, the access token generated by identity server would be JWTs. Otherwise, they will be just reference token. Right? Yeah. Then you can get the client ID and client secret. So I have a curl client here. Right. So I already have put this into a script. Yeah. So this has all the URLs to talk to the identity server to get the token, and this is my client ID and client secret. Now I'm using client conditional grant type here to get an access token. Okay, so this is the access token I got. This is normal OAuth client conditional grant type response. Right? This whole thing is a JWT. Now let's have a look at it. If you go here to jwt.io, okay. So here you can see these are the attributes. Here are the subject, right? And the issuer. This is the identity server, the authorization server, issued at expiration, and audience value. So audience here is a client ID. So this is once again defined in the OpenID Connect spec. If you use when you use OpenID Connect ID token, the audience of the ID token or the JWT there is the client ID, and then the algorithm. And also here we are using X5 key here. So this means this is an internal reference, right? So you should have the public key of the identity server to validate this JWT. X5T means you get the thumbprint of the expiration certificate. So using this thumbprint, you can find it from a local storage in your client side, right? So basically you need to have the identity server's public key beforehand. So using that, you can retrieve the key and then validate the signature. Okay, so another application. So in Kubernetes, so default token secret, it's a JWT again. So I assume you are aware of Kubernetes. Right, so I assume you are aware of. So I'll get that other question after this one. So the question on the PID parameter. So with the default token secret, yeah. So with the default token secret, so whenever you create a service account, the Kubernetes will create a token secret for that. And when you deploy a pod, if you don't specify a service account, then the default service account will be used to deploy that pod, right? And this particular token secret will be available to all the containers running under that pod, and they can use that JWT to access the Kubernetes API server. So let me quickly do a demo on that and show how it works. Okay. Okay. So now I have a set of deployments. Okay. So now let's see the secrets available in my Kubernetes cluster. Okay. So this shows all the secrets. So this is the default token secret, which is corresponding to default service account, and this is corresponding to another service account I have created, right? So if you want to look at one of those secrets, let's say default, and let's get the YAML format. Okay, so now here you can see the token. This is JWT, right? Let's copy this one. But if you look at this clearly, this doesn't look like a JWT, right? Because this doesn't have any dots, right? No dots here. So in Kubernetes, this token is token is the base 64 encoded JWT, right? It is not base 64 URL encoded. The JWT itself, the whole thing is base 64 encoded. So what if you want to look at this one? What we can do is go here, not base 64 URL encode, but you need to do base 64 decode. Go here, paste it here, decode. Okay. So now you will get this one. Let's do this one. Okay. Decode. Okay. Copy this one. Now, if you look at this one, this has 3 dots, right? This is for the Hussein header dot, then the claim set, and then the signature. Now, if you copy this one and go to jw.io, now you can see the content here, right? So this is an algorithm, there's a key ID, and then the issuer, this is corresponding to the Kubernetes, the token issuer, and then the subject, this token is corresponding to the default service account, and you can see this doesn't have an audience, right? So this doesn't have audience. So that means when you use JWT, this JWT to access the Kubernetes API server, it won't do any audience validation. Now let's see how we can use this JWT within a Kubernetes pod to access the API server. Okay, so now here I need to log into a container running in my STS deployment. Okay. Okay, so I'm inside the container now in my STS deployment. I need to do a curl to the Kubernetes API server, so I don't have curl installed. So let me install curl in this particular container. Okay, so now I can add the token secret. So this particular token secret you saw before, it's mounted to each container, right? So it's in this path. Then run. Okay, then token. So this is the same JWT you saw before, right? So let me export this to environment variable. Export, let's say token. Okay, so this is JWT. Now I need to invoke an API in the API server using this token. Right? So this is the command I'm going to use. So this is the API I'm going to invoke, right? And here I need to pass this JWT as HTTP authorization header as a bearer token, right? So this is how you access an API secured with OAuth 2. So this won't work. The reason is you can even though you pass this token, this particular user account is not allowed to access Kubernetes. The default service account is not allowed to access the Kubernetes API server. So authentication will pass, but the authorization will fail. Right? Yeah. So you can access it, but you cannot get the resources back. You get the forbidden message 403 because you are not permitted to access. Right. So you need to give that particular role to the default service account, then you should be able to access. But this is how you can use a JWT in a Kubernetes environment to access the API server. Yeah, so there's a question, can you put claims into Kubernetes API to control which service can access other services? Yes, so I'll do an example of that. So you can the common way of doing that is in the service mesh architecture, you can define these access control policies with the Istio service mesh, right? So you can use any other service mesh too, but the example I'm going to show you next is using Istio. So if you move to the next slide. Okay, so this is a way of enforcing JWT authentication for your microservices with Istio, right? So you can define a policy and say you use JWT authentication, and you can specify issuer and also the audience, and also here JWT's URI is, so this points to your public key or the JWT key, right? So what happens is you get so in an Istio deployment, you have the microservice, and all the requests come into a microservice fronted by Envoy proxy. So Envoy proxy sees this policy and extract out the JWT from the request, and it will check whether it is issued from this particular issuer, and it will validate the audience, then it will validate the signature using the this particular JSON web key. So it will basically fetch the key from that particular endpoint and use that to validate the signature of the JWT. And also based on the claims that comes in JWT, you can define access control policies with Istio. I don't have an example, but you can do it. So you can define like if it is a role, you can define that if you want to access a service, like do a get or post to this particular service, you need to be in this particular role. Right, attribute-based access control and role-based access control you can do with Istio policies. Okay, so another application of JWT is Open Policy Agent. It's a general purpose policy engine. It has its own language of like creating policies. So in this particular example, this is a policy written in Rego, right? And this is a request, right? So you can have enforcement points at any place, right? Even in an Istio environment, you can use ONOE as a policy enforcement point. And if you use a Kafka server, so there you can have sort of filter to do the access control enforcements. Even Kubernetes, you can have admission controller to do the access control checks. Then you create from the PEP, policy enforcement point, you create this input message. So here you can see you have the JWT. And this includes a resource. So you are going to access order/101. You are going to do a get, and this is your employee ID. So this can be any attributes, and you send that with the JWT. And here you can define a policy based on the claims in this particular JWT, right? So here you say whether the token payload is the claim set and has this particular role. So if you only have this particular role, then you can do a get to this particular resource. Okay. Yeah. So this is another application of JWT. I won't go into details. So if you have SPIFFE, so SPIFFE is a project that helps you to bootstrap trust between multiple workloads in a platform agnostic manner. It is doing that with something called SWID, SPIFFE verifiable identifier. So it has two formats. One is the X509 based SWID and the JWT based SWID. So there's spec for that. So here you get each workload. A workload can be a microservice or a pod. It can be anything. Then it gets a JWT as its SWID. So you can use that JWT to authenticate to other services in a standard manner. Right? So this is another application of JWT. Okay, so that's what I planned for this session. Any questions? Maybe if you have any questions, you can just unmute and ask it as well, or else just put it into the chat.